With the new year, obviously, comes a lot of reflections, and I talked about that a little bit in last week's episode. On one hand, we're very focused on the future, what goals we want to accomplish in the new year, but I think another huge part of this time of year is reflecting on the past, thinking about what we did accomplish in the previous year. And I know some of you will relate. I experience this all the time, I think especially because most of my life has been online. But embarrassment at our past selves. This can range from, a minor little incident that you're like, oh, that was cringy, to a lot of built up shame and just a little more extreme, of an emotional response. In this article I read, he said, so often it is not our own response to events or situations that go wrong. It is the judgment of others and the subsequent feelings of not feeling good enough that will persist. So this is where shame comes in, I know for me and a lot of you maybe that are on a healing journey, you think back to past mistakes that you made, or even just choices you made, when you were a little less healed or when you didn't know. Brené Brown, Queen of Shame, defines shame as the belief that you are unworthy of love and of belonging. Often when we feel shame, we feel very othered, and maybe there's thoughts like, oh, I'm all alone, everyone is judging me for my mistake. And having this shame can also create a sort of defensiveness and a hyper awareness, which is basically perfectionism, right? And again, Brené Brown says, where perfectionism exists, shame is lurking. I've talked about perfectionism on this podcast before. I feel like it's something I've definitely struggled with, and I don't even think I knew I struggled with it till like this year, honestly. I always thought perfectionism was like, the girls in school that had the best handwriting, like their projects always looked the best because, oh, they were perfectionists. It's like when people say, oh, I have OCD, and they just like things organized. Perfectionists frequently get discouraged and give up on long-term goals because they're unwilling to tolerate feeling less than perfect. The problem with perfectionism isn't high standards, it's the intolerance of difficult feelings. And the difficult feelings being, if I mess up, if I don't do this perfectly, or if this doesn't go perfectly, then I am not enough, I'm not worthy of love, I'm not worthy of belonging. So it's kind of like, oh. So what do we do when we feel embarrassed or cringy at our past selves, or even ashamed? I think a really big part of healing, there's like the realizing where you went wrong before. Like, oh, if I had known then what I know now, I would have done that differently. Which is great because it shows that you've learned, but then it can also bring this almost like judgment upon your past self. So I think it's really important to practice empathy to your past self and remind yourself that you didn't know. Or especially if it's something light, like, oh, my fashion used to be so cringy. Or for me, like when I watch old videos, sometimes I just feel like I'm so like hyper almost. Ew, I can't believe I did my makeup like that or whatever. And it's like, bro, like that's just how I knew how to do it at the time. When it comes to bigger issues and maybe memories that bring up a little or a lot more shame, I feel like it's even more important to practice empathy and self-love in that way. And just to really remind yourself, like, I didn't know then what I know now. It's also important to reassess the power that you give other people's judgments, because again, a lot of feeling embarrassed or cringy or ashamed of past decisions, again, however big or small they may have been, is the feeling of like, oh my God, I can't believe other people saw me like that. Like embarrassment, it's kind of like, oh, I'm embarrassed that other people are going to see this and perceive me as not enough or as stupid or as like, oh my God, she has like the worst makeup. And therefore it's also so important to practice confidence. If you want to start dressing more your own unique style, it can definitely be scary and like, oh my gosh, what are people gonna think? But then it's like, when you look back, you will look back at yourself like, oh my God, even if that outfit was cringy, at least I, wasn't afraid to be myself and I had confidence and like, that's what I liked at the time, so I rocked it. This is so embarrassing, but is it though? In 8th grade, there was like this time where I was super into thrifting, and especially like vintage thrifting. I loved making lookbook videos, and I would dress to school like wearing these like vintage maxi dresses and like hats, and I had these heels. I swear they were like 4-5-inch heels, but I would like wear them to school. People would tell me like, oh, I thought you were like a teacher walking in the halls, or like, oh, like I thought you were a teacher walking in the classroom, because the shoes would like make that certain sound. So I mean, I definitely look back like, oh, that's kind of cringy a little bit, like this, like I was like unnecessarily extra. But then I think at this time, especially now that I'm like way older, I'm like, that's kind of iconic. Like, that's so cool I did that. Would I be like, yeah, I'd really recommend you wear like all these vintage clothes and like huge heels to school with like a little straw hat? No, but like it was a moment. Like, I was doing what I wanted to do at the time and what I was into, so that's kind of iconic. Or like when I think of this guy that I used to talk to when I first moved to LA, now looking back after, after just growing older, bro, after learning the game a little more, but also about learning about like attachment styles, watching Pretty Boy KB on TikTok, it's like, obviously this guy did not like me, like, obviously. But I just like was so oblivious to it. And so that's like embarrassing to look back on. That's not like a deep, like rooted, like shameful memory for me, but it's definitely like, oh my God, like, bro, I did not know anything. So yeah, I think it just comes down to like, do what you want in the moment, like, again, with your style and stuff. And I think it's also about having self-trust. Like, I trust myself to make the right decision for me at this time. Like, I could change my mind later, or maybe I'll look back on this and wish I did it differently, but I trust myself to make the right decision for me now. Brene Brown's 4 ways to move through shame for those, maybe a little tougher memories. It's not just like, oh, my makeup was bad one year. It's like, no, like something actually really shameful happened to you, maybe something really embarrassing. For me, it's always like memories of a teacher yelling at me or something, and I just like never forgot it. And I feel like that's where a lot of shame starts for people. It's kind of crazy to look back and think at all the teachers that really just like publicly humiliated kids, like young kids, just so unaware, how that was going to affect the kid, how that was going to make the kid feel. But yeah, just that vibe of like an authority figure speaking down to you, especially in front of a large group. So the 4 ways are, number 1, to understand shame triggers and where you feel it in your body. When I feel shame, I usually feel it in my chest or like almost my stomach. You get punched in the stomach feeling, or it's almost like I want to vomit. Or like, when your friend shows you an ugly pic of yourself and you're like, ugh, like it's almost like that. The second thing is to develop critical awareness. Feel your feelings and don't bury them. So a great way to help with this is journaling, because you can just really get everything out. Third way is to seek connection. If you have a friend you can talk to. This really reduces shame as well, because a large part of shame is like, oh, I'm the only one that has felt like this, that feels like this, I'm like the odd man out. And again, that like othering kind of feeling. And the 4th thing is to seek empathy. Empathy for yourself, getting empathy from a friend. It really goes a long way. I think especially for yourself, when you can practice empathy for younger versions of yourself, it's so important. And I think for me, a big thing that's helped me get through a lot of stuff like this, just painful memories, shameful memories, is learning about them like this. Education is so key, and I just really wish that mental health was more normalized to be talked about and also taught about. We didn't learn about mental health at all in school. We had health class, but that was all like physical stuff. And I'm sure there was like a brief section on mental health, and they're always saying like, oh, mental health is so important, but I feel like our society just doesn't really reflect that. And I think especially growing up, so many people aren't given the tools needed to get through hard things, like hard emotional things and traumatic things. And then you have teachers, yelling at young children, traumatizing them. So anyway, learning about it has been really key for me, because I can just like, it's almost like fitting the puzzle pieces in and like making connections. And it's like, oh, like I made that decision because I was feeling this way. Therefore, I can empathize with that version of myself. And I think another more lighthearted thing to keep in mind is that if you feel embarrassed at old versions of yourself, it's only because you keep glowing up, so remember that going into 2023.